Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: President Trump saying Chinese leader Xi Jinping called him on the phone. Beijing denies that official talks happened. Meanwhile, an American business group in China says exemptions may be coming for some U.S. goods.
China says it hasn't happened.
I spoke to him numerous times.
International students in the U.S. face scrutiny. A recent report says the State Department revoked nearly 300 visas from Chinese students. A closer look at possible reasons why.
When it comes to foreign visas, the Secretary of State has the right to revoke visas of those who we feel are acting in an adversarial way to our foreign policy interests here in the United States.
President Trump greenlighting a new order to make deep-sea mining easier. More on how it could help challenge China's dominance in critical minerals. And a House committee issuing subpoenas to 3 Chinese telecom companies. An investigation is underway to find out whether these firms endangered American data privacy. President Trump said Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping called him on the phone. That update just one day after Trump announced that the U.S. and China were talking trade. Beijing denied holding those talks and is now denying that the Chinese leader called the U.S. At the same time, some American businesses in China are reporting a change, that their products are now getting exemptions from the 125% tariffs imposed by China.
I don't want to comment on that, but I've spoken to him many times.
U.S. President Donald Trump reiterated that Xi Jinping had called him after Time magazine published an interview on Friday. In the interview, President Trump said, quote, "He's called, and I don't think that's a sign of weakness on his behalf," though the president did add that he would not call Xi. Chinese officials denied the talks between the two nations once again. Beijing outlined preconditions for negotiations with the U.S. At the top of the list, a demand that the U.S. cancel its punishing tariffs on Chinese goods. President Trump pointed out that the U.S. decision to lower tariffs or not depends on China's actions.
So 145, I haven't brought it down. I said it's a high tariff. It is a high tariff, but I haven't brought it down.
Washington has imposed 145% tariffs on Chinese goods. Beijing retaliated with 125% duties on U.S. imports. The Chinese regime has vowed to fight against U.S. duties, but it may be quietly weighing tariff exemptions on essential U.S. imports. Michael Hart is the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. He said, quote, "Anecdotally, companies are reporting that they are able to bring in some items without tariffs. Microchips, life-saving drugs, and aerospace parts could be among products exempted from China's tariffs." What's more, 20% of the U.S. tariffs on China were imposed as punishment for the country's failing to stop the flow of fentanyl from China to the U.S. Beijing insists that the opioid crisis in the U.S. is Washington's problem. At the same time, a local Chinese court in Jilin province just sentenced a drug salesman. The man mainly sold theophylline, a drug often used in conjunction with other medications. Markets rose on Friday on hopes that tensions may ease between the world's 2 largest economies.
And in the end, I think what's going to happen is we're going to have great deals. And by the way, if we don't have a deal with a company or a country, we're going to set the tariff. But we're dealing with a lot of countries right now, and could be with China, but maybe we'll make a special, a deal.
According to the White House, more than 100 countries have already approached U.S. for trade negotiations. The Trump administration's trade team has met with 34 countries this week alone. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that the third quarter of this year is a reasonable estimate for achieving clarity on long-term tariff levels. Next, educational website Pi News is reporting that the U.S. government has revoked over 1,800 international student visas, and nearly 16% of them are Chinese students. Chinese students are the second largest source of international students in the U.S. The data includes cases voluntarily submitted by over 270 colleges as of earlier this week. Therefore, the real number could be higher. According to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, these people could be more likely to have their visas revoked, including those who committed crimes, supported terrorism, or engaged in other activities in violation of U.S. policies. Here's White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt addressing concerns around Chinese student visas Tuesday.
We have over 250,000 Chinese nationals in our country right now on student visas. Does the administration believe there's any national security concern when it comes to those over 250,000 Chinese nationals in our country?
Well, as you know, when it comes to foreign visas, the Secretary of State has the right to revoke visas of those who we feel are acting in a adversarial way to our foreign policy interests here in the United States. He has that authority according to the Immigration and Nationality Act.
Tensions between the U.S. and China have hit a record high due to the trade standoff, as well as continuous accusations that Chinese students are stealing U.S. intellectual property. On the Chinese version of TikTok, a video began circulating that gives Chinese students advice on how to avoid having their U.S. student visas revoked. It was posted by a person working for a company that helps Chinese students apply to study abroad. The video recommends students not to cross U.S. political red lines, referring to topics that violate U.S. national interests. He also recommended that they keep their social media pages set to private and told them to avoid unnecessary travel outside the U.S. before graduating in the U.S. China just canceled over 13,000 tons of U.S. pork exports. A Thursday report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture says the cut represents the biggest cancellation of pork orders since COVID-19. According to the U.S. Meat Export Federation, China has imposed a 172% tariff on U.S. pork imports. In 2024, China was the third largest market for U.S. pork exports, behind Mexico and Japan. The country imported more than 500,000 tons of American pork. Meanwhile, the USDA says China imported only 1,800 tons of U.S. soybeans. That's a steep drop from around 73,000 tons imported earlier in April. A chief economist with the American Soybean Association says that China accounts for roughly 60% of all U.S. soybean exports. Revitalizing American dominance in deep-sea mining to counter China. President Trump signed an executive order Thursday to do just that. The move fast-tracks offshore deep-sea mineral mining in the Pacific Ocean. NTD's Daniel Monahan has the details.
The move aims to accelerate America's ability to explore, harvest, and process strategic mineral resources from the ocean floor. Deep-sea mineral deposits come in various forms, including potato-sized nodules, rich in nickel, cobalt, manganese, and copper. They form slowly over millions of years, several miles below sea level. One region, southeast of Hawaii, contains an estimated 34 billion wet metric tons of these nodules, metals within them valued at more than $10 trillion. Currently, China dominates global supply chains for most of these critical minerals and has recently taken steps to block exports to the U.S. The initiative isn't without controversy. A report from Berkeley cautions that mining activities could disrupt deep-sea ecosystems, disturbing habitats for organisms like sponges and corals that rely on the mineral nodules. Hegseth dismissed the controversy as the result of disgruntled former employees. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
The House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party has issued subpoenas to 3 Chinese telecom companies: China Mobile, China Telecom, and China Unicom. Lawmakers are seeking confirmation on whether these companies granted China access to American data through their U.S.-based operations.
The move comes after the FBI said China has gained access to U.S. telecommunications, energy, and water facilities through cyber attacks. The committee has called for full cooperation from the telecom firms by May 7th. A committee spokesperson said the companies had sidestepped an FCC ban on their U.S. operations by using unlicensed equipment and cloud services.
Coming up, how risky is using energy infrastructure built by China? A congressional commission zeroes in.
Chinese manufactured hardware could introduce hidden vulnerabilities such as remote kill switches and data collection capabilities.
Iran's foreign minister visits his Chinese counterpart days before another round of nuclear talks with the U.S. What Iran said about the process. And trade, defense, and China, 3 pivotal areas where Britain could align with America under Trump. A new report warns failure to do so risks diminishing the UK status as a primary U.S. ally. That and more in just a minute here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A congressional commission is analyzing the risks of using energy infrastructure built by China. One commissioner said the sector is a potential battlefield for the CCP. NTD's Jason Blair has more.
In a hearing, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission focused on the situation and risks of China's role in critical mineral supply chains, fossil fuel markets, and overseas clean energy infrastructure investments.
Officials in capitals around the world are now investigating the risks of Chinese investment and control over critical electrical infrastructure. Chinese manufactured hardware could introduce hidden vulnerabilities such as remote kill switches and data collection capabilities.
And Mr. Brand says that recent intrusions by state-sponsored actors into critical U.S. infrastructure like Volt Typhoon serve as indicators of China's capabilities and intents.
When the United States raised concerns about these cyber operations last December, Chinese officials reportedly linked these activities to geopolitical tensions over Taiwan, a sobering reminder that energy infrastructure has become a potential battlefield in great power competition.
Senator Clark Goodwin says that China accounts for 2/3 of the world's wind and solar power projects that are under construction.
China positions itself as a climate champion, but in reality, it has been the world's largest annual emitter of carbon dioxide for almost 20 years.
The hearing also focused on China's global dominance in critical mineral supply chains and the risks of countries being dependent on China for them.
There are strong indications that China is consolidating its hold over critical minerals and is prepared to use its position as geopolitical leverage amid escalating trade tensions.
Yet critical minerals are perhaps the most vivid illustration of how Beijing leverages its central position in energy supply chains to support state interests.
Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
Today marks the 26th anniversary of a historic appeal for freedom of belief in China. On April 25, 1999, over 10,000 people who practice spiritual meditation system Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, peacefully gathered outside Beijing's Central State compound. They were there to request the release of practitioners who had been detained and to clarify misunderstandings during a period of growing repression. With no banners or slogans, the silent appeal was widely reported by Western media and is seen as the largest peaceful faith-based petition in modern Chinese history. After authorities promised to release the detainees, the crowd dispersed peacefully, leaving the area spotless. In spite of this, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, later used the event as a pretext for launching a brutal persecution that continues today. Falun Gong is a spiritual practice based on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. After its rise in popularity, the CCP launched a systematic campaign of persecution against the group. Ever since, the Chinese regime has brutally targeted Falun Gong practitioners, seeking to destroy them financially, mentally, and physically, which includes forced organ harvesting. Iran's foreign minister visited his Chinese counterpart on Wednesday ahead of another round of U.S.-Iran nuclear talks slated for Saturday. President Trump aims to stop Iran's nuclear development. Iran's foreign minister said the nuclear talks with the U.S. were moving in the right direction, but it was still too soon to judge.
If Americans continue to stay in a constructive way and avoid any unrealistic, undoable demands, I am confident that we can get to somewhere and we can conclude a good deal.
The same day, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency said Iran had agreed to allow a team in to discuss restoring camera surveillance at their nuclear sites. And he said the agency knows what to look for. To discuss the Iranian foreign minister's China visit, NTD Steve Land spoke to Alireza Jafarzadeh for his take. He's the deputy director of the National Council of Resistance of Iran and author of The Iran Threat.
Alireza Jafarzadeh, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much.
Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, he's visiting China ahead of a new round of nuclear talks with the United States. The visit is seen as quite significant in deepening political trust between those two authoritarian regimes. What do you expect to come out of it?
Well, I don't really expect much out of it because whatever the Iran regime does nowadays, you have to see it within the context of the biggest crisis that is facing the regime, which is the nuclear negotiations with the United States, whether it's their trip to Russia or a trip to China, meeting with them. They want to create this perception that they are dealing with the superpowers, with the big powers in the world. And the reason they're doing it, because the regime has actually no leverage coming to the negotiating table. They are at their weakest point ever.
What role would you say China is playing in Iran, and what's the goal in strengthening this relationship on both sides?
Well, the Chinese have been helpful to the regime, and to some extent, they were buying the Iran regime's oil, especially when there were sanctions imposed on them. And particularly during the Biden administration, the regime managed to go around even the limited sanctions that existed, because none of them were practically enforced. And China was a big help in buying, providing money to the Iranian regime. But in terms of strategic alliance, long-term economic relationship, there are no replacement for anybody. Even the Chinese understand that if the regime is not allowed in the economic market and they cannot comply with the free world, there is not going to be a major prospect for change for them. And that's why even the Chinese are looking at the outcome of the nuclear talks between the United States and the Iranian regime. Remember, whatever economic benefits the regime will get, it's not going to change the equation. It's not going to improve the economy, because the economy of the Iran regime is corrupt, is controlled by the Revolutionary Guards and the supreme leader. No matter how much money you inject into the Iranian economy, it will end up in the pocket of the clerics and Revolutionary Guards, or end up supporting and funding their proxies in the region, or the nuclear weapons program of the regime. So I don't read very much out of it. I think the United States should understand that these are a lot of maneuvers that the regime is doing at the same time that they're trying to see what they can get out of the negotiations.
Now, given reports that Moscow may be a destination for Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium, might Russia play a key role in brokering a nuclear deal?
Just keep in mind that this regime is doing everything out of desperation. They're faced with the Iranian population who want change. That's where I think the focus should be, for the nuclear negotiators in the United States, that the real end to the nuclear threat of Iran or their threat in the region is an end to the rule of the clerics. And of course, that's the responsibility of the people of Iran and the organized resistance. All the U.S. need to do is to recognize this reality, recognize the right of those who want to bring down the Ayatollahs, and then you will see what a huge change that will bring, not just for the people of Iran, but for the whole region.
Excellent point, not to forget about those voices that are calling for freedom in those totalitarian countries, and perhaps elevate them. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Steve. Always a pleasure.
A think tank is urging London to preserve relations with Washington. To do it, the UK would have to align with President Trump's new direction for America, especially in security and defense. China policy could be a major factor in whether Britain remains a key U.S. ally. At the same time, China has big investment ties in the UK. NTD's international correspondent Malcolm Hudson has more for us from London.
Trump's second term as president presents a decisive shift in U.S. foreign policy under his America First doctrine. In a new report for the Henry Jackson Society, Associate Fellow Darren Spink says this means heightened demands on Britain to respond and align swiftly with his priorities, particularly in regards to defense, trade and China. Failure to do so, he says, risks the UK's status as a primary US ally. Spink's report says Britain's choice not to retaliate against the steel and aluminium tariffs may aid free trade deal negotiations. But he warns closer economic ties with Beijing could strain relations, particularly Chinese investment in strategic British industries.
AI obviously would be of great interest, semiconductor manufacturing, defense industry, but even the agricultural sector. The security of food is utmost concern for national security.
He said this also includes capital outflows from the City of London to China.
Specifically into dual-use sectors, technology sectors that may actually improve and modernize China's military capabilities.
Instead, he said there is an interest in aligning development policy between the US and UK. Now, after the initial tariff trade war comes to an end, Spink says the world will likely pivot to the question of maintaining economic connectivity in a post-globalization era. He suggested Britain could integrate into the US-Mexico-Canada agreement that would anchor the UK into the North American trade bloc. Meanwhile, a joint US-UK initiative in a post-war Ukraine would reinforce ties while also granting the UK stakes in sectors such as rare earth mining, an essential area for defense and technology, but currently dominated by China. Despite differences in political outlook between Trump and Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Spink says Trump is an Anglophile or someone who loves Britain, and that this closeness of cultures plays to the UK's advantage.
I believe there is a kinship, and most importantly, as an Anglophile, the president views the security of the hemisphere with utmost importance.
He said that strategic alignment on shared security and economic interests will be the key to preserving the strength and relevance of the US-UK alliance. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For on-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you soon.